Welcome to Coffee and Conflict, a National Security Institute podcast where I sit down with leading authors and experts every fortnight to discuss some of their most recent works and the bigger picture of national security, foreign policy, and intelligence issues. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at the National Security Institute and senior vice president at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. This season, we'll be covering topics ranging from the war in Ukraine, 21st century defense strategy, and the intensifying strategic competition between the United States and China, and more. So grab your first or second coffee of the day and let's begin. Today, I'm joined by Richard Fontaine, co-author with Ambassador Robert Blackwell of Lost Decade, the U.S. Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power. Richard is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for New American Security. He previously served as the president of CNAS and as a senior fellow there as well. Before joining the center, he was a foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain and worked at the State Department, the National Security Council, and on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He previously served as foreign policy advisor to the McCain 2008 presidential campaign, and subsequently as the minority deputy staff director in the Senate Armed Services Committee. Prior to that, he served as associate director of the Near Eastern Affairs at NSC, and he also worked on Southeast Asian issues at the NSC's Asian Affairs Directorate. Richard, welcome to Coffee and Conflict. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
As a starting point, I think a bit of a policy history is necessary to set the scene for Lost Decade. This very much focuses on the pivot, but what was the pivot? What was it meant to be, and how did it originate?
It started in 2011 during the Obama administration, really with a long article that then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton wrote for Foreign Policy magazine. The word pivot wasn't in the title of that, but it was mentioned there. And the notion was that the United States had been overinvested in other parts of the world, especially in the greater Middle East, given the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the war on terror, that Europe was fairly quiescent, and that the United States over previous years had not fully reaped the benefits nor met the challenges in Asia to the degree that it should, and henceforth it would. So this would be the pivot to Asia. The idea was that by pivoting to Asia, that is reallocating greater national security time, attention, and resources to Asia, especially but not exclusively from the Middle East and Europe, the United States could both better benefit from the great demographic and economic promise of Asia and also stabilize to a greater degree its relationship with China, which at the time the administration thought could be constructive. So that was the pivot. And this book that we wrote looked at that kind of grand strategic impulse to put Asia first in U.S. foreign policy, really for the first time ever.
Now, you talked about the sort of the drivers behind the pivot, the desire to pivot away from a rebalance from the Middle East to take advantage of the opportunities coming out of Asia, and particularly in China. But how much of this was actually a well thought out sort of policy idea or set of policies, and how much of it was more of an abstract idea or a set of principles that the administration at the time wanted to pursue?
When you interview the people who were policymakers at the time, which we did, they largely said that that particular article that Secretary Clinton wrote became known as the Pivot article, and some of the immediate follow-up statements were not intended to articulate some grand strategic departure for U.S. foreign policy, but rather to summarize the greater intensity that the administration had put on Asia since the beginning of the Obama administration. And so they did summarize a bunch of the things that they had done up to that point, but they also talked expansively about the promise of Asia. They talked about the possibilities of the U.S.-China relationship, and they importantly talked about what they plan to do in Asia economically, militarily, diplomatically. And the first sentence of the article said, now that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are winding down. Now, that was a separate thing, as we all know, because they weren't necessarily winding down. But when you put it together, it was not intended to say, you know, there will be a before this article came out and there will be an after this article came out and the strategic reality should be entirely different, but rather to summarize it. But once it was out, it really attracted support both inside and outside the administration and did become an orienting principle for U.S. foreign policy through the Obama administration and beyond. And you can see that in various strategic documents and presidential statements and efforts, at least, that administrations made to try to give meaning to the pivot to Asia.
Now, based on that, I'm curious your thoughts about how much, again, building off of that, that the issues that resulted from the pivot were a function of the failure of the pivot policy itself versus perspectives thereof. I mean, because it seems that you're describing that the idea of the pivot to the Indo-Pacific sort of accreted around this idea, which was not necessarily meant to be a specific, well thought out, detailed strategy, but a collection of policies. So were the ambitions the public had for the pivot broader than what the administration had at the time?
The way I think about it is, as a strategic impulse, it was very solid and remains solid to this day. I mean, one of the arguments that we make in the book is that we should pivot to Asia now. So as a strategic impulse, as a broad strategic direction, it's right, and it was right then. But there were a whole variety of things that got in the way of executing the pivot to the degree to which certainly the architects had intended. And so, no, there wasn't, a detailed strategy from the very beginning that says this is what a pivot means and this is how we'll know if we pivoted and how we will know if we did not, and this is what we will achieve if we do, and things like that. And in fact, over the months ahead, there was a decent amount of improvisation. I mean, kind of articulated a little bit of this in the history, but there were various fact sheets and speeches, and sometimes there'd be 4 lines of effort, and sometimes it would be 7, and sometimes there would be 5 key activities, and sometimes it would be 4 or 3 or 5. So again, there was broad consensus around the strategic direction. It was much harder to make the hard choices that a pivot to Asia would entail. And then, of course, you had all these other things that were happening: politics at home, events abroad, wars that one expected to end but did not, things like that. And so that got in the way as well.
I want to pick up on that. If you could dive into what I found fascinating, of course, across the lost decade to articulate, is the interplay of domestic political priorities and challenges, as well as the international environments. I'm reminded almost of the Godfather line where we're trying to get out of the Middle East, but they keep pulling us back in. Can we look at the domestic situation first and the role that Congress played in particular for stymieing some of the pivot to the Indo-Pacific, but also how that interplay affected the administration's effort at the time? And then we can go to the geopolitics next.
Sure. Well, again, as a broad strategic concept, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the pivot on both sides of the aisle and in Congress. So there are plenty of statements at the time where Republicans and Democrats came out and said this is the right course. I mean, even political leaders who were otherwise not terribly disposed to be favorable to the Obama administration generally liked the notion of pivoting to Asia. But of course, it's the details that ended up mattering. And so you can look at the economics, you can look at the military side, you can look at the diplomacy. The diplomacy side was more or less up to the administration. The military side, so much shared, and the economic side, you had to have Congress. The centerpiece of the economic pivot to Asia, and arguably the centerpiece of the pivot to Asia period, was the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, which as late as 2015 probably could have gotten through the Congress had it been negotiated and finalized at the time, but it wasn't. It was finalized in 2016, which people may remember was a fairly eventful election year, including at the presidential level. And the Obama administration tried to push through and ended up not actually submitting the agreement to Congress because it became clear it couldn't pass. And so there, with one fell stroke, you had sort of the death knell for the economic element of the pivot, which had broader strategic implications. And of course, Donald Trump came in and said, well, we're getting out on my first day, and actually withdrew the United States from the agreement. And so you had that. On the military side, you had this word that I'm starting to hear again, disturbingly, called sequestration, which, again, for those who may remember this, the notion at the time was, let's come up with something so harmful, inane, and boneheaded that it will induce Republicans and Democrats who otherwise can't agree on anything to come together on a budget deal so as to avoid that dumb, inane, harmful outcome. Well, they formed all of that and then didn't come to that agreement. And so the harmful, inane thing, sequestration, went into effect, and it cut $500 billion out of the defense budget. This took effect over multiple years. We had a shrinking defense budget precisely at the time when China was really amping up its military modernization and expansion. And so, again, you had, domestic politics. The sequestration didn't have anything to do with the pivot to Asia. I mean, it wasn't the Republicans and Democrats didn't say, oh, we don't like the pivot to Asia, therefore let's put this sequestration thing. But the collateral damage of that was very much to the pivot to Asia. So you could see, for example, the Navy saying, okay, henceforth, as part of the pivot to Asia, 60% of the U.S. Navy will be deployed in the Indo-Pacific. You say, oh, wow, that's good. I mean, that's pivoting to Asia. But it was a shrinking Navy because the overall defense budget. So even if the slice of the pie that Asia got was bigger here and there, the overall pie was shrinking. And so those are some of the ways in which Congress and the domestic politics influenced, the outcome.
And then looking at the geopolitical side, which was not insignificant to say the least, how did those realities in the Middle East, but also elsewhere, and the difficulty of balancing the priorities at a time of wanting to pivot to the Indo-Pacific, how did those priorities impact the pivot?
Well, this is, the British statesman who said, what should I expect? Events, dear boy, events. And one of the lessons of this history is that there's just not going to be a time when other key regions of the world are quiet for some sustained amount of time so as to let the United States, which after all remains a global power, focus on Asia to the exclusion of Europe and to the exclusion of the Middle East. And so, in 2011, when the pivot was announced, as I said, the first line of the article said now that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are winding down. And so there was an expected peace dividend from being less active, having fewer troops, being less engaged in the Middle East. But as we all know, the war in Afghanistan went on for another decade. It didn't wind down. And the United States did withdraw all of the remaining troops from Iraq in 2011, but then ISIS metastasized there, and they went back in 2015 in greater numbers than would have been necessary for a residual force, and engaged in a very resource-intensive 5-year campaign to beat back the ISIS caliphate in the heart of the Middle East. So the claims that other regions of the world have on U.S. time, attention, and resources remained critical to the equation then, and maybe obviously now. That's absolutely the point now. You look where our military resources are going versus where they are not, where our diplomats are spending the time versus where they are not, where military assistance is going versus where it is not, and things like that. And you have this phenomenon. So part of the challenge here is not do you focus on Asia to the complete exclusion of other parts of the world, but has the United States balance its interests and commitments and resources across multiple regions, all of which are going to remain important, but nonetheless, Asia is going to be the preeminent one of them.
I want to stick in the Middle East because one of the things I find quite striking about the book is the deep dive that you and Ambassador Blackwell take on the regional impacts of the pivot and how the pivot was seen regionally. Looking specifically and just staying with the Middle East specifically, you chart the time, the attention, the resources spent the United States in the Middle East. But how was the pivot seen by our partners in the Middle East? And then I want to talk about the other regions as well.
Well, in the Middle East, it seemed to most of the leaders and policymakers there as an explanation for why the United States wanted out of the Middle East. It wasn't the only explanation, because you could look at polls at the time, and most Americans thought the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan weren't worth fighting in the first place. You had multiple presidents commit to withdraw troops from or end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, these then called forever wars. So there was this notion that the United States had sunk huge amounts of blood and treasure into the Middle East with very little to show for it. And so that was becoming, I think, increasingly obvious. And then you had this sort of strategic framework of the pivot to Asia, which led many in the Middle East to say, they care more about Asia and more about China than they do about the Middle East. What does that mean for their commitments here? Are they going to fulfill their commitments here? What if they don't fulfill their commitments here? Does that mean they're going to move resources? What does that mean for us? And so there was a lot of question marks in the Middle East. And again, this coincided with broader question marks over the course of a good decade plus about U.S. staying power and commitment to the region. Because if there was one thing that remained true through, Obama, Trump, and Biden, they all committed to end these wars and reduce the American troop presence in the Middle East. So that's what it did, is raise a lot of questions, but not supply a whole lot of answers.
And pivoting, if I can use the phrase, unfortunately, there, to looking at Europe, because Europe, the lost decade from the 2011 to 2021 was largely, I wouldn't say certainly a time of peace, but certainly more peaceful than we are today with Russia's expanded invasion of Ukraine. The annexation of Crimea, the operations in Donbass and eastern Ukraine, 2014, were relatively benign by comparison. How did Europe view America's pivot to the Indo-Pacific at this time? We saw the United Kingdom adopting its own lexicon of, I believe it's called a tilt to the Indo-Pacific. You had Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin suggesting that the United Kingdom plays a better role in Europe than in Asia. What was Europe doing during this time, and how was it responding to America's desire to pivot to the Indo-Pacific?
Europe seemed pretty quiet, and that was one of the reasons why policymakers in Washington thought that a pivot would be possible. You're winding down wars and reducing your presence in the Middle East, and you certainly wouldn't need to increase it in Europe because Europe's pretty quiet. If you look at the almost 5,000 word article that then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton wrote that sort of launched this notion of the pivot, Russia's nowhere to be found. It was just a different time, although it was only 3 years before Crimea. So that equation changed dramatically. The effect that this had, that these kind of announcements and speeches and indications the United States was going to pivot to Asia had on Europe was, again, to raise, as in the Middle East, a lot of questions, but probably with even fewer answers. Because for the Middle East, I think it was obvious that the United States wanted out militarily to the degree it could. And the question was, what kind of commitments will it continue to fulfill, and what's a diplomatic and sort of counterterrorism role look like? In Europe, the administration hastened to reassure the Europeans that it didn't mean that the United States would not fulfill its commitments in Europe, that it wasn't going to say, we don't care about Article 5 of NATO or none of this other stuff. But it then left the Europeans say, well, what does it mean? What does it mean does that mean that the Americans are leaving? And does that in turn mean that we've got to do more for ourselves on security matters, and the Americans less? So it raised a lot of questions, and ultimately, both in Europe and the Middle East, it fed a sense, at least for a time, that the United States was going to be departing the region in favor of Asia. And then in Asia, it raised expectations of what the pivot would deliver in terms of time, attention, and resources. And again, because of events and politics and policy choices and all kinds of other things, there was not the kind of profound shift that either Europe and the Middle East worried about or that Asia expected.
If I can stick with the Asian expectations, I mean, what did the region expect to see substantively and practically from the United States, and how did the failure of those expectations to be met, how did that impact America's standing within the region?
Well, diplomatically, as Asian policymakers will tell any American who ever visits, showing up means a lot. And so they have this variety of multilateral fora, from the East Asia Summit to APEC to all these other kinds of things. And they thought and expected that diplomatically, U.S. senior, either the president or the Secretary of State, would show up at virtually all of these multilateral gatherings, that they wouldn't get pulled away by priorities either at home or in the United States, and that there would be a bigger diplomatic footprint in terms of just activity and trips and things like that. We actually measured this for what it's worth, looking at this, and whether a particular president or particular Secretary of State went to Asia more, or the Middle East or Europe. Well, they all went to Middle East and Europe more than Asia. Secretary Hillary Clinton did really step up the diplomacy in Asia, and President Obama, in the immediate aftermath of the pivot, did things out there. But the rest of it, again, was sort of captive to events and also policymaker preferences. Some secretaries of state liked to go into Asia, and others liked, trying to get a Middle East peace deal or an Iran nuclear deal or a deal with the Russians over Syria, and that kind of guided their ability to show up in Asia. So on the diplomacy side, one of the expectations was they're going to be here visibly, diplomatically. On the economic side, increasingly, it became that TPP would, again, be the centerpiece, and that was because that's what the Americans said. The Japanese, at the beginning, TPP was a small four-country trade agreement that was not very consequential. I mean, one of the countries was Brunei of the four. But as it grew over time, and once the U.S. got involved, it became, a really promising pan-regional trade agreement. And then the big prize was Japan, and Japan, to the surprise of many, agreed to enter. And so it became a de facto U.S.-Japan free trade agreement, the likes of which people thought would never have been possible, plus all these other countries. And so once countries had entered into TPP negotiations like Japan, because the United States was in it, what they expected was that when they get a deal, it'll be done. And of course, the case was the opposite, and the U.S. couldn't get it through the Congress, and so the rest of the TPP countries moved on without the United States.
If we take a look at in the background, because one of the things we haven't discussed yet is what China was doing during this 10-year period from 2011 to 2021. What was China doing regionally and globally in the background at this time?
Well, it was growing in power and ambition for a couple of reasons. One, in terms of its ambition, the global financial crisis in particular in 2008 seemed to have convinced the Chinese leadership, including soon-to-be President Xi Jinping, that the things they had to learn from the West were far fewer than had been popularly advertised, that the West day was probably done and it was in eclipse, and China's ascendance was irreversible. That in turn led to much greater ambition in terms of its activities in the South China Sea, with respect to Taiwan, with respect to economic coercion of countries throughout the Indo-Pacific, like Japan and the Philippines and South Korea and so forth. And it's also its activism in terms of developing alternatives to, Western originated institutions in the international order. The economic weight of China, which was already big at the beginning of this period, really just kept going, so that by the end of the decade in question, China was the top trade partner of almost every country in the Indo-Pacific, and the top trade partner of countries outside the Indo-Pacific to a large degree. And so that really continued. And then, of course, militarily, in terms of resources and capability, the line remained sort of up and to the right. If you were to chart it throughout the course of that decade, with significant increases in the Chinese military budget, the acquisition of capabilities in key areas like missiles and hypersonics and subs to some degree and things like that. So ultimately, you had a more militarily powerful China. It had greater economic gravity than it did at the beginning of the period. It was more ambitious in terms of foreign policy and diplomacy than it had been at the beginning of that period.
But you just mentioned when we were talking about the Indo-Pacific and their Asian allies and partners about the importance of showing up. There was a lot of talk, certainly events and papers and publicity about various elements of the pivot. And then it didn't seem, as you articulate in the book, and you're just mentioning that it didn't materialize the way that was expected. And I'm curious, what was China's takeaway from that in terms of American credibility, American power, and American purpose at this time? And what are the lessons that they derived from this lost decade?
Well, I think the Chinese leadership over time, the pivot is part of this, but it's not exclusively about the pivot, has seen the United States and the broader West as a group of fractious, divided democracies that are unable to marshal the national political will to accomplish big necessary things in the way that China, with what it believes to be a hyper-efficient autocratic command economy and political system, can. And so this to the Chinese was evidence. See, they have this big strategic impulse, and they have their own domestic politics to deal with. Well, you don't have to have that in China. Um, I think again, especially if you look at the period from 2016 probably until the present, the doubts about American democracy and our polarization and our ability to marshal our resources and capabilities politically in ways that would allow us to do big national things, we haven't exactly disabused anybody of that notion. And so I think that's fed the perception that, again, China was inevitably on the rise, and the Americans in particular were on the decline, not least because of their, kind of inefficient political system that just wasn't up for the kind of competition that China would be able to marshal. Now, I think over the past couple of years, they may have come off that belief to some degree, but I think you see some pretty strong evidence that that's how they thought for quite a while.
In terms of looking at the pivot as being a strategic shortcoming in terms of its execution, it also seems that there were a lot of missed tactical opportunities. You can debate whether it's sort of tactical or strategic here. But for example, with President Obama in office and China's literal expansionist foreign policy in the South China Sea, it seemed at the time that there was an expectation that the United States would push back more firmly than it did. And I'm curious, how much did little missteps at a tactical level like that, if you think it is a misstep there, how did that impact our ability to assert our interests in the region vis-a-vis China?
Well, it did, and you don't have to take my word for it. Barack Obama said that the U.S. had an interest in China not militarizing features in the South China Sea, and had a famous meeting with Xi Jinping at the White House where he said, you can't do this. We don't want to see. We know that you've claimed the South China Sea. We don't recognize that claim, and we don't want you to militarize what you claim there. And Xi Jinping said, "Okay, I won't," and then turned around and did. And we didn't do much really in response to it, not even sort of performatively. I mean, we did freedom of navigation exercises, and still do. But the issue in the South China Sea is not just freedom of navigation and whether commercial or even military vessels can travel through those waters, but rather the features that have been claimed or reclaimed in some cases, militarized, and allows China to project power 1,000+ miles further from its shores than it would be otherwise. And I mean, that's kind of a done deal at this point, but it wasn't a done deal back in 2011, and there was an insufficient American response to that. That said, I mean, in terms of our allies, they didn't do much to respond either, other than often complain to the Americans about what was happening and say someone needs to do something about this. So, this sort of, and the other part of this was it was sort of the salami slicing tactic, right? So no particular event was so catalytic. They didn't invade Ukraine. There was nothing so catalytic that or dramatic that would have elicited some sort of major response from the United States and like-minded countries. And so the upshot was that by the end of this period, China effectively had control of key features across the South China Sea and claims the entire waterway as a Chinese lake and has military capabilities on multiple places there.
I want to quote a chunk of the book because I think it sums up the lost decade very, very well. You write, the period from roughly 2011 to 2021 thus represents a lost decade. Had the United States pivoted to Asia as intended, it would be better able to deter war with China today. Pivoting to Asia would by no means have eliminated the Chinese challenge. It would, however, have made it easier for the United States to manage it. And we've talked a lot about where it has been unsuccessful, but I'm curious, two parts. One is, where has the pivot been successful, or where have you seen it looking through to today? But also, if we look back, what would a successful pivot actually have looked like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question because it is easy to focus on areas in which the pivot fell short of its initial aspirations. But I think the first great accomplishment of the pivot was intellectual. I mean, if you stop even amid these raging wars in the Middle East and Europe today, if you were to stop the average U.S. government policymaker in the street or the average member of Congress or senator, and you say, if you were forced to pick what is the most important region in the world, what would you pick? I think most of them would pick Asia. You just wouldn't find a lot of people picking other parts of the world. And so intellectually, that was an important sort of mental shift in terms of how the starting point for policy. The other on the military side was, if you look in 2011, the U.S. military was a large force that was configured for counterterrorism and stabilization operations across the broader Middle East. That was really its prime effort. And by the end of this period, it was reconfiguring itself for a great power conflict, likeliest to take place in the Indo-Pacific. Now, there's all kinds of caveats that go along with that, with particular capabilities, the size of defense budgets, other things that sort of fell short. But nevertheless, that's a big shift. And again, it started sort of intellectually. But you don't see very many people now saying, the top responsibility for the U.S. military needs to be to topple governments in the Middle East and occupy territories in various places. So on the intellectual side, it really mattered. On the diplomacy, and again, there was this sort of manifest reality that China was more ambitious in its foreign policy, and the United States had to show up. And I think you see a greater diplomatic commitment, even if it's sometimes difficult to actually fulfill that commitment to the Indo-Pacific. So I think in terms of sort of broad direction, intellectually, strategically, I think the pivot has sort of won in that sense, and the challenge is to give it ever greater meaning on the ground in terms of economics, military, and diplomacy. If the pivot had been achieved, your second question, what would the world look like now? Well, there would be economically the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So U.S. companies and growers would face lower barriers to trade, lower tariffs, and other barriers to trade with friendly countries, which would be good for the U.S. economy and good for economic relations with allied or like-minded countries that otherwise are trading with China. So that would be one. It would have been a signal of sustained U.S. commitment to Asia, which we provided the opposite, and may have avoided some of the hedging which one saw for a few years, where countries really were uncertain about America's enduring commitment, and also uncertain about whether China was going to be successful in this grand ambition to be more dominant in the region. I mean, militarily, had we been able to provide more capability in the Indo-Pacific, potentially in more places, then you would have greater deterrence now, and I think probably less of a sense that we needed to hurry and catch up to try to right the deteriorating military balance in the Indo-Pacific, which has been the story of the last few years. And then diplomatically, the hardest to pin down of all, but because these things are sometimes kind of hard to measure, but diplomatically, I think it would have been a more reassuring signal to our Asian friends and allies that the United States is a resident power in the Indo-Pacific and is going to remain so, and a message to the Chinese that they are not going to dominate the Indo-Pacific in some sort of hegemonic, hierarchical kind of way. So those are the things that I think, had the pivot been successful, it could have delivered. Some of them are a little more abstract than others, but I think they're all real.
If we look back to Europe, because I'm curious your thoughts on this one, because we've seen a crystallization or a catalyzation of a greater concern about Chinese, not just Chinese behavior, but also Chinese power from European countries. We've seen conversations about opening a NATO office in Tokyo, which President Macron nixed. NATO summit has had several big pillars on Asia and China. Has the European attitudes towards China and Europe's role in relationship with the Indo-Pacific, has that fundamentally changed? And do you see that as potentially a benefit or a side perk, if you will, of America's attempted pivot?
Yeah, it has, broadly speaking. I mean, there are country exceptions to that. So Serbia, Hungary is certainly not in the same place as most of the other European countries on China. The British post-Brexit are more, I would say, hawkish on China and bullish on their role in the Indo-Pacific than they were before. The French, suspicious and skeptical of China, but also wanting to sort of forge their own path and be a leader on the continent. And so, not always singing from the same song sheet, even when Macron and Ursula von der Leyen go to Beijing, right? So there are differences, but broadly speaking, Europe is in a very different place on China today than it was even a few years ago, where the talk from a lot of European policymakers was, well, we don't have to choose between the United States and China. We want this robust economic relationship with China. And of course, we want economic relationship and security relationship with the United States. This should not actually involve, trade-offs. You Americans are kind of too hawkish and tough and maybe even paranoid about what China's rise represents. And Xi Jinping did a lot of work to disabuse them of their notions. I mean, it'd be nice to say the American diplomacy really persuaded lots of people, but some of this again is country specific. But after China moved into Hong Kong and abridged its internationally agreed upon commitments to one country, two systems, the Brits, for historical and quite obvious reasons, found themselves kind of crossing a Rubicon. They were much tougher on China and skeptical of China afterwards than before. When the EU was about to pass an investment agreement with China, and there were human rights sanctions the EU put on, and China retaliated by sanctioning key European Parliament members, and that scotched that. And or when Lithuania had the temerity to allow the Taiwanese to rename their resident office there, and the Chinese reacted with an embargo on Lithuania. I mean, these are the kinds of things that have successfully raised real skepticism about Chinese power and intentions in Europe. And so I think that is likely to continue. There's this broader question, which there's many competing theories about, which is, why has China seemingly alienated so many countries around the world needlessly, simultaneously? And will it course correct? You've seen attempts at a course correction here and there. The wolf warriors are not as loud as they were a few years ago, and all of this. But I think some of this is just the way it's going to be. And you see this with Asia policy too. So, I mean, I don't know, you talk about this period we're talking about at the beginning of it. I don't think a single European country had an Asia strategy or a published Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, lots of them do. The EU has one, France has one, Germany has one, the Brits have one. And so they're increasingly seeing the strategic stakes in a way that is, in Asia, in a way that is similar to how the United States has. And by the way, other allies like Japan.
If we fast forward to today, so the period from 2011 to 2021, we've had President Biden seems to have achieved a sort of partial pivot, if you will. You've had the AUKUS agreement, you have the Quad, you have a lot of multilateral diplomacy going on. How would you grade the last several years of the Biden administration in terms of pursuing a China and Indo-Pacific policy?
I think it's strongest in the diplomacy for the reasons you said, not just the examples that you gave, but other things too, convening the ASEAN leaders at the White House for the first time ever, the diplomacy that they had with the Japanese and the Koreans and the Japanese and the Philippines, in these sort of trilateral frameworks, the Quad, and elevating that to the senior level, or to the summit level, and then giving it real things to do, vaccine initiative originally, but now maritime security issues and information sharing. So there's a lot I think you can point to on the diplomatic side, which was really useful and helpful. On the military side, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. On the posture side, the places side, there is actually a lot to show for their efforts. So the United States has greater base access to the Philippines today than it had a couple of years ago. It has base access in Papua New Guinea. It is modernizing the alliance with Japan in important ways and working with Japan and South Korea in trilateral ways. And of course, Japan itself is doubling its defense budget and things like that. So on the posture and the alliances side, and then with Australia, you mentioned AUKUS, but you could mention, long-range bombers based in Northern Australia and other things that the United States is doing with Australia. So I think there they've got some things to show. On the capability and the sort of budget side, that's where it's harder because, the Navy has been shrinking. The Air Force is not really expanding. And so the capability resident in the region so far has not kept pace with China's military modernization expansion. What you've seen as a result, especially given the geography, is a continuing deterioration in the Indo-Pacific military balance toward China and away from us and our allies. But maybe some slowing in that at least, and then hopefully a turnaround. And then on the economic side, there's not really much. I mean, the TPP went belly up in 2016 and has never been revived and is very unlikely to be revived. The Biden administration came in with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was a pretty modest economic agreement. There was a trade component to it that didn't allow for any market access and would not have to be approved by the Congress. So everybody thought, well, okay, if anything's fine, it's got to be that. And then last fall, even that provoked a political reaction from some key senators who said, you got to get rid of that or it's going to jam me up in my reelection. And so even though the allies had agreed to that sort of de minimis agreement, the administration dumped that. So there's really nothing to be shown on the economic side in terms of agreements and things like that, other than on the defensive side, harmonization of export controls and all of the things that you see on the tech and economic side with respect to China. But in terms of the sort of proactive stuff, you don't really see anything. But, inshallah, we'll have a new president next year, and we can all start hoping that there's something to be said for that agenda here soon. But, who knows?
Well, it's good that you brought that up, because one of the last questions I want to ask you is, we're less than a month away from the presidential election. It would seem at a very broad level there is a bipartisan consensus that the strategic competitor is China, strategic adversary is China. Potential President Harris, potential President Trump, style and substance are markedly different. I'm curious if you were to handicap it, what would, regardless of an administration, either Republican or Democrat administration, what would a successful next 4 years when it comes to China look like? So I won't put you on the spot for picking who's going to win or what they're going to say, but for your mind, what would a successful next 4 years vis-a-vis China and the Indo-Pacific look like?
Well, I do know who's going to win the presidential election, but I'm going to keep it to myself just for the purpose of this podcast, just so. But I know with 100, my crystal ball is absolutely clear. But that is actually a joke because I don't think anybody's got a good crystal ball these days.
It's all imported from China anyway.
The big picture with China is to avoid war without capitulation on our key interests and values, right? We don't want China to upend the regional and global order, because those regional and global orders have been good for the United States, been good for other countries, allow for the flourishing of democracy in key areas, allow for the free exchange of commerce and forward basing and security and territorial integrity and sovereignty and all these things. So we want to maintain all of those things, and we don't want the price of maintaining those to have to be what could be a potentially catastrophic war with China. So that's what we want. And if we can get to the end of 4 years where we have a China that is either unable or unwilling to upend the regional and global orders, and we've successfully deterred a war with China, that is, in broad strokes, what success would look like. You'll note that it does not, in my mind, look like the toppling of the Chinese Communist Party, nor does it look like some grand bargain accommodation where the U.S. and China sort of agree to disagree and work out some kind of division and we have a breakthrough and all that. I don't think either of those regime change or grand accommodation are possible or desirable. And so then we're left with competition, and that competition is going to go on for a long time, but you can engage in that competition better or worse and more successfully or less successfully. And if we engage in it as successfully as possible, then I think we've avoided war and we've maintained the protection of our key interests and values and the regional and global orders.
I think that is a fantastic summation and a very actually clear articulation of what our strategy towards China and Indo-Pacific should be. So with that brings our latest episode to a close. I want to thank Richard for joining us today. Thanks, as always, to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI staff and helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts. This episode will also be available on YouTube and NSI's webpage. Make sure to join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks. As always, if you like what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to reading the not a lost decade, but a successful decade in the next coming years that you write.